The cruiser Emden, one of two ships of her class, and the one that truly made her name in a very short and very spectacular career. But to tell it properly, we have to start a long way back. In 1873, in Hanover, Karl Friedrich Max von Müller was born, the future captain of the Emden, the son of a Prussian army colonel. He began his naval service on training ships, and after a string of postings and a case of malaria picked up during a deployment to German East Africa, an illness that would trouble him for the rest of his life, Müller's fortunes turned, on a single appointment, to the staff of Admiral Prince Heinrich of Prussia, on whom he made an excellent impression. After that, his career climbed steadily. Promoted to Korvettenkapitän in December of 1908, then a posting to the Imperial Navy Office in Berlin, where he impressed Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz. And as a reward for that work, in the spring of 1913, he was given a command of his own, the light cruiser Emden. He quickly earned fame in the German and foreign press for his skill in shelling rebellious forts along the Yangtze near Nanjing during the Chinese upheaval of 1913, and was decorated with the Order of the Royal Crown, 3rd class, with swords. By 1914, the Emden lay at the naval base of Tsingtao, part of Admiral Maximilian von Spee's East Asia Squadron, poised to sail straight into history. But before the adventures begin, we need to meet the second key figure of our story. In 1881, in Zwickau, in Saxony, Helmuth von Mucke was born, the son of an army captain. He trained on the school ship Charlotte and later the battleship Kaiser Friedrich III. He became a Lieutenant sur See in 1903 and spent years in the torpedo boat service before joining the Emden as her first officer with the rank of Kapitänleutnant. In 1906, in Danzig, the third main character of this saga was laid down, the light cruiser Emden, a Dresden-class ship, ordered under the Kaiser's fleet expansion program. She was meant as a replacement for an older vessel, the Pfeil, which is why her provisional name during construction was Ersatzpfeil. Construction dragged on, money was short, as usual, and part of the funding was raised by public subscription among the citizens of the city of Emden, in whose honor the cruiser was named. By 1909, she was launched, fitted out, armed, and commissioned into the Imperial German Navy. She was a very elegant ship, a long, lean silhouette and 3 slender funnels with a full load displacement of roughly 4,250 tons. Her main battery was 10 10.5-centimeter guns, backed by a secondary battery of 8 5.2-centimeter quick-firers, plus 2 45-centimeter torpedo tubes below the waterline. Her armor was light. She was, after all, a light-protected cruiser, exactly as the name implies. An armored deck about 30 millimeters thick, thickening to 50 on the sloped edges where the deck angled down to meet the hull, and a conning tower behind 100 millimeters of plate. Her power came from triple expansion steam engines of about 16,000 horsepower, which on trials pushed her to nearly 24 knots, a very respectable result for a ship with reciprocating machinery. In fact, she was the last ship of her type built with such engines rather than turbines. In service, her speed rarely exceeded 23 knots, understandable since by then she was heavily loaded. Her lead ship, the Dresden, was fitted with turbines and ran about half a knot faster. Her service began on an uneasy note. In April of 1910, she had barely got acquainted with home waters before she was assigned to the East Asia Cruiser Squadron and sent to Tsingtao, Germany's main naval base in Asia. She made the passage across the Atlantic, around Cape Horn and across the entire Pacific, and managed it well, arriving by October. The plan was for her to serve as a station ship, showing the flag, but that quiet duty didn't last. It was interrupted by a native uprising on the island of Pohnpei in the Caroline Archipelago, which belonged to Germany. Emden took part in putting down the revolt, during which one officer was killed and 5 sailors wounded. After that, she returned to station duty, nominally peaceful, but there was no time to be bored. In 1911, she collided with a Japanese steamer and had to go in for repairs, then resumed service in the Central Pacific. By 1912, Emden had won the Kaiser's Gunnery Prize as the best shooting ship in the entire Pacific Squadron, and in 1913, fresh unrest broke out in China, the so-called Second Revolution that followed the fall of the empire. She was fired on from shore a few times and traded shots, though she took no losses. In May of 1913, Emden received her new commander, Karl von Müller, a genuinely experienced officer who knew exactly what service far from home out in the colonies really meant. His years in the Admiralty had brought him close to Tirpitz, and it was almost certainly there that Müller absorbed Tirpitz's view of the coming war at sea, a war assumed above all to be against Great Britain. And in that view, an enormous role was given to commerce raiding, cruiser warfare against the trade routes. Because Britain was not simply a very large empire, she was first and foremost a maritime empire, dependent on seaborne trade almost completely. Those vast sea lanes were her weak point, and that idea had been tested before, at least as far back as the early 19th century. We remember how nervous the British were about the raiding potential of Russian cruisers out of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky during the Crimean War. The mere presence of those ships in port was enough to spread fear. In May of 1914, Emden returned to Tsingtao, where she exercised with the armored cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, ships made famous by the opening battles of the war, their victory at Coronel, and then their destruction at the Falkland Islands. But at this moment, they were the main striking force of the cruiser squadron, led by Vice Admiral Graf Maximilian von Spee. On the 20th of June, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau received orders for a Pacific cruise. Müller, by now a Fregattenkapitän, was left behind in Tsingtao. You cannot leave a base entirely without ships, but the international situation was crackling. The smell of war was in the air. It was clear by now that Russia, France, and Britain, long rivals who had now settled their differences, were lining up against the bloc of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Italy was drifting out of the Triple Alliance, and in her place loomed Turkey, the sick man of Europe, where the Germans had made enormous strategic investments in the Baghdad Railway. And in the Asian region, a huge role was played by Japan, who had just proven herself a great naval power and who was a natural enemy of Germany, since she meant to take Germany's holdings in China. By the end of July, the dispatches were piling up. War was coming. For just such a case, Müller held a sealed packet of orders. Above all, under no circumstances allow himself to be bottled up in Tsingtao. Everyone remembered the fate of the Russian squadron at Port Arthur. He was also to cover the departure of the colliers meant to fuel the German squadron and then head south toward the ports of French Indochina to lay mines and raid the trade routes. On the 31st of July, the far-sighted Müller brought Emden to full readiness, coaling, taking on provisions, throwing every unnecessary thing ashore, and slipped out of Tsingtao. On the 2nd of August, a telegram caught up with her, war between Germany and Russia, and the storm broke. Müller had meant to head south. Instead, against the original plan, he turned north, toward the Tsushima Strait, reckoning he'd find a target there. His calculation paid off completely. At 4 in the morning, on the 4th of August, right at the mouth of the strait so infamous in Russian memory, his lookouts spotted a silhouette. The vessel bolted, but the cruiser was far faster, and after several warning shots laid across her course, she stopped. The prize was the Russian mail steamer Ryazan of the Volunteer Fleet, about 3,500 tons, carrying passengers from Nagasaki to Vladivostok, the first prize taken by the Imperial German Navy in the entire war. Because there were civilians aboard, Mueller escorted her back to Tsingtao, landed the passengers, and, finding her a fast ship at 17 knots, had her converted into an auxiliary cruiser, rearmed and renamed Cormoran. Emden topped up coal, provisions, and ammunition once more, and that evening put back to sea, together with the steamer Prinz Eitel Friedrich, a former mail liner now serving as an auxiliary cruiser and collier. They set course for the Mariana Islands, for Pagan Island, the rendezvous point with von Spee. By the 12th of August, Emden picked up the German ships there, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the light cruiser Nürnberg, the auxiliary cruiser Prinz Eitel Friedrich, colliers, and other support vessels. A day later, von Spee held a council of war aboard the flagship, and the situation was grim. Japan's entry on the Allied side was a near certainty, and that would put the squadron in a horribly vulnerable position. Enemy bases on every side, French and British, the Australian fleet, and a Japanese fleet many times stronger than anything von Spee had. So he resolved to run for Chile, whose government was well disposed toward Germany, to take on provisions, make contact with the embassy, and then make for Wilhelmshaven, the main Atlantic harbor of the Imperial Navy. When von Spee laid out the plan, Mueller didn't object so much as refine it. Light protected cruisers, he pointed out, were poor help in a fleet action. Better to release one, Emden, to head the other way, into the Indian Ocean, where the shipping lanes were busy, where Singapore lay, and where a single cruiser could strike a real blow at the region's trade. Just as importantly, a lone raider broadcasting on the radio would mask von Spee's run to Chile for a while, and a single light cruiser, not terribly hungry for coal, was far easier to keep supplied than a whole armored squadron, so she could sustain a long, successful solo cruise. The Chief of Staff backed Mueller, and von Spee signed off on it. On the 14th of August, Scharnhorst and Nürnberg left Pagan Island, and Emden began independent raiding and wrote her name into history as one of the most successful raiders of all. Along with her went the collier Marcomania to keep her fueled. By the 19th of August, the little detachment reached a German-owned island, coaled, picked up news, and Emden turned southwest toward the Sunda Archipelago, a choke point she had to slip through quickly to break out into the open Indian Ocean. The straits were full of ships, including huge fishing fleets. Slipping through unseen, even at night, was simply impossible. So First Officer von Mucke had an idea. Instead of hiding, why not show ourselves openly, but in disguise? They built a fourth false funnel out of wood and canvas and set it behind the first three, and the four-funnel silhouette of a light cruiser now closely resembled, especially from a distance, the British cruiser Yarmouth, which was actually known to be in those waters. Her presence would surprise no one. On the 28th of August, Emden passed through the Lombok Strait and into the Indian Ocean, and ran down along the coasts of Java and Sumatra. On the night of the 9th to 10th of September, she sighted the lights of a lone ship, the Greek steamer Pontoporos, carrying coal bound for Calcutta, coal clearly destined for the British and therefore fair game. But the clever Müller made the Greeks an offer they couldn't refuse: enter German service for pay. The captain didn't much care whether his coal was bought by the British in Calcutta or by the Germans on the spot, and he agreed. So the Pontoporos, with her 6,500 tons of coal, became another of Emden's colliers, though the coal turned out to be poor grade. On the morning of the 10th of September, a column of smoke. Emden found a large steamer on a converging course. She'd taken the cruiser for the Yarmouth. A warning shot, and she proved to be the British vessel Indus, converted to a troop transport, but, luckily for the British, empty. Emden stripped her of stores and sank her. The next day the British liner Lovett, also empty. The same routine: crew off, seacocks open, and down she went. By the 12th of September, Emden held a prime position on the Calcutta routes. By evening, she stopped the British freighter Kabinga, but her cargo was documented as American property, and there was no point spoiling relations with a neutral, so Müller released her and used her to carry off the crews of the sunken ships. A few hours later, the collier Killen scuttled because her coal was the same poor grade. On the morning of the 13th, the steamer Diplomat, carrying 10,000 tons of tea from Calcutta to England, a genuinely precious cargo, the richest prize so far, sent to the bottom. Then the Italian Loredano appeared. Italy was still neutral, so her captain was made to give his word to keep quiet, and she was let go. The next day, the 14th of September, Müller released the Kabinga with all the rescued crews, and while the transfer was underway, the British steamer Trabach appeared, was captured, and was sunk. On the 15th, Emden took the British ship Clan Matheson, loaded with cars, locomotives, and steam machinery, a real strategic catch, then turned toward Rangoon. By now, the world knew a German raider was loose in the Bay of Bengal, and British cruisers were thrown into the hunt. After the Clan Matheson, Müller changed course and headed west toward Madras. The hunting near Calcutta had been extraordinary, barely time to sink one ship before another appeared. But Madras lay off to the side. There no one was expecting him. Madras was a vital base. It had oil storage tanks kept permanently full because ships fueled from them constantly. A tempting target, but the real aim was larger than tanks. The point was to sow genuine panic in colonial India, and to hint to the population whom it was better to befriend. If unrest or instability followed, that would be worth far more than all the captured ships combined. Emden approached Madras unseen, timing her arrival for the night of the 22nd of September. False funnel back in place, and was astonished to find no blackout at all. The shore lights and lighthouses were burning as if it were peacetime. No one here had even dreamed of an enemy cruiser. She swung her starboard side to, switched on her fighting searchlights, picked out the oil tanks, and opened fire from about 3 kilometers. Within a few salvos, the tanks were ablaze, a fire so huge it made the searchlights unnecessary, so they were switched off while the cruiser kept firing. By the time the British woke and the shore batteries answered, Emden had darkened her lights and was constantly shifting position. The gunners had little to aim at. The shore guns got off a handful of rounds. 3 landed close aboard, a warning because a single 6-inch shell could have caused this light cruiser real trouble. Müller checked fire and turned for the open sea. The bombardment was devastatingly effective. Some 5,000 tons of oil burned, and 5 merchant sailors were killed, the only such deaths Emden's guns would cause in the whole campaign. But the main result, as Mueller had calculated, was the panic. The European population fled inland in alarm. Insurance rates leapt, and many captains refused to sail at all without guarantees of safety or compensation. Mueller had strained the entire Allied merchant trade and become, for a time, the most famous man in Asia. From Madras, Emden drew off, running north with full navigation lights to mislead the enemy, then dousing them and doubling back south toward the busy waters off Ceylon. On the 25th of September, she took 2 prizes in a single day, the steamers Timerick and King Lud, both sunk. The next day she stopped the Greif Vale, transferred her prisoners, and let her go empty. On the 27th came the collier Burresque, with 6,500 tons of excellent Cardiff coal meant for the Royal Navy, so fuel was no longer a worry for a long time. On that fortune she pressed on, taking the Foyle and the Ribera. The raiding was almost absurdly successful. Even the best raids of the Vladivostok cruiser detachment during the Russo-Japanese War had done many times less damage, and they had sent out 4 cruisers at once. Here, a single cruiser had beaten the results of a whole squadron. By now, the Marcomannia's coal was used up. She was released, and the Burresque became the main supply ship. Marcomannia sailed away, and no one knew it was forever, while Emden turned south for the Chagos archipelago. On the 9th of October, she reached Diego Garcia, well off the main routes, to overhaul the ship and, above all, to scrape a hull so foul with weed that it was costing her as much as a knot and a half of speed. There was a complication. The islands belonged to Britain, but progress had not yet reached Diego Garcia. There was no radio station, and the locals simply didn't know war had broken out. Mueller didn't enlighten them. He graciously had the governor aboard, laid on a fine table, and the governor went away delighted, even presenting Emden, in friendship, with a generous supply of fresh provisions. The German sailors, in gratitude, repaired the governor's broken launch. They were, after all, highly skilled men, and so, to mutual satisfaction, on the 10th of October, Emden and Burresque left the hospitable shores of Diego Garcia. Mueller's instincts very nearly failed him here, though in the first half of the campaign the man had the nose of a fox. Because right on the Germans' heels, the British armored cruiser Hampshire arrived at Diego Garcia, a ship a head stronger than Emden. You can imagine her captain's astonishment when he was told, "Oh, you're not the first. Some German cruiser was just here. We even helped scrape her hull and fed her crew, and they fixed the governor's launch." The governor, no doubt, was every bit as stunned as the captain. Mueller made heavy use of radio interception and knew the British weren't expecting Emden in the region she'd just left, so he turned north again, into the waters between Ceylon and Aden. The calculation paid off. Between the 16th and 19th of October, in just 3 days, Emden took a string of prizes. The less valuable ones were released with prisoners. One ship, the Exford, was kept as a collier. The rest were sunk. But luck cannot last forever. 3 or 4 days in one region was already tempting fate, so Mueller turned his bow toward the Malay Peninsula, where he meant to attack the British port of Penang. To set the scene, a few weeks earlier, the Russian light cruiser Jemchug had set out to hunt for Emden. Her boilers were badly worn, and the plan was to repair her at Singapore, but the British wouldn't let her in and redirected her to Penang instead. There, the cruiser anchored, let her fires die down except for a single boiler, and set about maintenance with much of the crew gone ashore. Now, anyone with the slightest knowledge of naval affairs of the steam age understands that one boiler is not nearly enough, not even to power the gun hoists, let alone bring the ship to readiness, which would be impossible until you'd lit off the other boilers. The captain, second-rank Captain Ivan Cherkasov, felt unwell. The tropics aren't kind to everyone, and he went ashore, especially as his wife had arrived. The ship was left under the senior officer, Nikolai Kulibin. A couple of duty guns were left trained on the harbor mouth, but, reasoning that the blazing sun made it dangerous to keep men on deck, the ready-use ammunition had been moved down into the magazines, leaving just 5 rounds at each of 2 guns, forward and aft. Tropical languor and, in the end, tragedy. The defense, in case of trouble nobody expected, was supposed to come from 3 French destroyers guarding the harbor entrance, and British intelligence reported Emden in the Indian Ocean, at least 1,000 miles off. But Mueller had done the exact opposite of what the British calculated. He had hoped to find the French armored cruisers Duplex and Montcalm at Penang, a very daring plan, an outright gamble. He was counting on surprise, on the morning mist and pre-dawn gloom, on the dog watch when sleep weighs heaviest, on the unaccustomed heat, and on that indispensable 4th funnel that turned Emden's silhouette into the Yarmouth, a ship known to be hunting her and therefore expected. Some sources claim Mueller ordered the German flag struck on the way in, raising it only as he opened fire, a serious breach of the naval law of the time. Independent sources don't confirm it, and Mueller was known as a genuine naval knight. You could accuse him of much, but not of such brazen breaches of the law. Emden waited her moment, and in the early hours of the 28th of October, she entered the roadstead. A guard ship, the French destroyer Mousquet, paid the cruiser no attention, taking her for the Yarmouth, and even flashed a welcome by searchlight. Emden signaled, "Thank you." The Jemchug, meanwhile, had let her watch lapse, but she was the one warship in a roadstead full of brightly lit civilian vessels. The single dark, blacked-out silhouette, an obvious target. Emden made for the dark shape, identified it as the Russian Jemchug, no watch, no signalman, half dead, fired a torpedo at point-blank range, then opened fire on the bow, where the bulk of the crew would be quartered. The range was a single cable, about 185 meters. At that distance, there are no misses, and Emden had a champion gun crew. Jemchug was also a protected cruiser, armed with 120mm guns, heavier than Emden's, but total surprise and point-blank fire undid that. The armored deck was no help because the shells struck flat, straight into the unarmored sides. By a German eyewitness's account, the cruiser's bow was riddled in minutes. Flames swept the forecastle, and through the holes you could see the far shore. Panic broke out. Sailors leapt overboard. Officers tried to organize resistance, but it was only the imitation of activity. The boilers were cold but one, the hoists dead, shells passed by hand. Only 2 guns could fire, 5 rounds each. At the forward gun, Midshipman Sipailo and his crew managed 1 shot before a German shell killed them all at a stroke. The aftergun, under Lieutenant Rybaltovsky, managed 2 hits, not difficult at under 200 meters. So Mueller loosed a second torpedo, from 2 cables this time, another hit near the forward bridge, detonating the forward magazine. Again the German eyewitnesses. A column of gray smoke, steam, and spray rose some 150 meters. The cruiser broke in 2. The bow separated, and when the smoke cleared, Zemchug was gone. Only a mast stump above the water, and men swarming among the wreckage. Emden didn't stop to rescue them. The Luck had been pushed far enough, and there were plenty of civilian ships about to do it. On the way out, Emden was intercepted by the Musquet, whose crew had by now grasped exactly whom they'd so cheerfully welcomed. But in that crowded, partly neutral roadstead, the destroyer's torpedoes were nearly useless, and her guns were no match for a cruiser. Musquet fired a few rounds anyway, and Emden answered with a broadside. A column of black smoke, and it was over. The French sailors, though, them Mueller did order rescued. The harbor exit was far off, and the civilian ships might not reach them. Of 76 men, 36 were taken aboard. 3 later died of their wounds and were buried at sea with full honors, and the rest were transferred to a British steamer that had been stopped but not attacked, the Newburn. A second French destroyer gave chase, but a propeller shaft bearing overheated. She lost speed and lost sight of the cruiser. Emden got clean away, having sunk 2 warships, a cruiser and a destroyer. And that was the raiders' last stroke of luck, because less than 2 weeks later, on the 9th of November, she was caught and destroyed near the Cocos Islands. As for the Zemchug, of her crew, midshipman Sipilo and up to 85 ratings were killed. Many more were wounded, of whom several died. The Russian command opened an inquiry. The blame fell on Captain Cherkasov, who had left his ship in a dangerous situation, and on the senior officer, Nikolai Kulibin, who had failed to resist. Both were stripped of their rank, decorations, and noble status. At first, there was even talk of imprisonment, but these were experienced officers, too valuable to throw away, so they were demoted to ordinary seamen, and both went on to fight bravely on other fronts. Cherkasov in the Caucasus, where he won the Soldier's Cross of St. George and was restored to his rank in 1917, later emigrating to Paris and living until 1942. Kulibin, on the Northwestern Front, twice decorated and restored to officer's rank before a grave wound in 1917, from which he died in hospital a year and a half later. Months later, the cruiser Orel dived on the wreck of Zemchug and recovered only a gun, a machine gun, and some sights before slipping away to Singapore. Zemchug herself lay underwater for 6 years before the British raised her in 1920 and sold her for scrap. The cruiser had long been obsolete. At the burial place of her lost crew in Georgetown, the capital of Penang, the crew of the Orel erected a monument in 1915, and it stands there to this day. After Penang, Emden set out to destroy the British telegraph and cable station on the Cocos Islands, a strategic spot carrying the direct line between India and Australia. Early on the 9th of November, it approached Direction Island, where the station stood. Mueller had always been remarkably cautious, but this time he broke radio silence to call the collier Burresk, and the telegraph station picked up the unknown signal, checked their roadstead, found an unidentified warship at the harbor mouth, and broadcast an SOS. Miller was counting on surprise. The pre-dawn gloom should have let him land a party, destroy the station, and vanish before anyone arrived. But luck is a finite resource, and Emden's was spent. Miller didn't know that a large troop convoy was passing nearby, escorted by proper warships. On receiving the SOS, the escort sent the Australian light cruiser Sydney under Captain John Glossop to investigate, and she was only 2 hours steaming away. Muller sent ashore 3 boats with a landing party of about 50 men under First Officer Helmuth von Mucke, all he could spare since part of the crew was away on captured colliers. The party took the station easily and began destroying the equipment. And around 9 in the morning, the Germans saw smoke approaching. At first, they assumed it was the Burresk, but the lookouts soon made out 4 funnels and 2 raked masts, a warship. 3 months of hunting, and the British had finally run Emden down, not through skill, but by sheer chance, since every previous effort had failed. Finding 120-meter ship in the vastness of 2 oceans is, frankly, harder than finding a needle in a haystack. At 9:15, Sydney was identified as a warship. The landing party was recalled, but couldn't make it back in time. Emden, short-handed, weighed anchor and went to full speed. At first, Sydney was taken for the British cruiser Newcastle, but she was a far more powerful ship, larger, faster, newer, armed with 6-inch guns and outclassing her opponent head and shoulders. On the broadside, the Australians could bring 5 6-inch guns to bear, a broadside weight of about 205 kilograms, against Emden's 5 smaller guns, and a broadside of 72 kilos. Mueller understood he was in serious trouble, pinning his hopes on the superb work of his own gunners, accurate hits that might cripple something vital before Sydney closed to a range where she could simply sink him. At 9:40 the duel began. The Germans opened first at 10,000 meters, and the very first salvos were beautifully laid. Within moments, Sydney was being straddled and hit, the range greater than British intelligence had thought Emden capable of. A shell struck the bridge area and the forward rangefinder, and by sheer luck failed to explode. Had it gone off, the battle might have ended there. The Germans soon knocked out Sydney's rangefinders, a gun, and started a fire. The German gunners were genuinely magnificent, worthy of that Kaiser's gunnery prize. But aboard Sydney were brave, well-drilled men who contained the fire and kept fighting. In all, Emden hit Sydney about a dozen times, killing 4 men and wounding more than a dozen, but she could not inflict disabling damage. And all of it came early because Sydney was newer and faster, and her 6,000-ton size all but guaranteed that Emden's light shells couldn't truly cripple her. Then this ship, half again Emden's size and far faster, reached effective range, and Emden began taking 6-inch hits. At short range, those shells are a terrible threat to a lightly armored ship. Sydney shot away the forward funnel, cutting the drat to part of the boilers, so speed fell. Then the second funnel, then the electrical boards, so just as on the Jemshug, the hoists died, and shells had to be hauled by hand. The steering engine was knocked out, leaving Emden to steer on her propellers. A hit set off ammunition and started a fierce fire, almost impossible to fight given the casualties and the dead pumps. The Germans realized the battle was lost. One last chance remained, the torpedo, but Sydney was just too far for it, and soon Emden's torpedo flat was flooded anyway. At 20:11, an hour into the battle, Sydney fired a torpedo and missed. Convinced that going on was pointless, Mueller ran his ship onto the reef off North Keeling Island to save his surviving crew. Sydney then made for the collier Burresk, which her crew scuttled, taking the Germans prisoner, before returning to Emden around 4 in the afternoon to find the German ensign still flying, which, by all the laws, meant she meant to fight on. After an inconclusive exchange of signals, Glossop fired 2 more salvos. Minutes later, a German sailor climbed the mast and struck the ensign, while another waved a white sheet, and fire ceased at once. The next morning, Sydney sent across a note, and the surrender was accepted. The Germans were evacuated. Of a crew of just over 300, Emden had lost 134 killed and 65 wounded. Mueller and the survivors spent the rest of the war as prisoners, most on Malta. Mueller himself, sick with malaria, was eventually moved to England, attempted an escape, and was finally sent on to the Netherlands for treatment before being repatriated in 1918. After some controversy, the charge of losing his ship was set aside. He was awarded the Pour le Mérite, Prussia's highest honor, and finally promoted to Capitaine sur See, captain at last. He retired in 1919 on health grounds, settled in Blankenburg, and was later elected to the provincial parliament of Brunswick on an anti-class platform for the German National People's Party. He died there suddenly, worn down, most likely, by his recurring malaria on the 11th of March, 1923. The results of the cruise were, frankly, brilliant. Some 24 merchant ships captured or sunk, plus 2 warships, a cruiser and a destroyer. And yet, remarkably, in all her attacks on civilian ships, the only deaths Emden's guns caused were the 5 at Madras. For that, the press of the day and even her enemies regarded her warmly, and for her handsome silhouette, they gave her a beautiful name, the Swan of the East. 2 later German cruisers were named Emden in her honor, and after the war, 2 frigates as well. Emden's wreck sat on the reef of North Keeling into the 1950s before being broken up. 3 of her guns were saved. One can be seen right now in Hyde Park in Sydney, its battle scars and all, genuine. Captain Glossop, for his part, was made a Companion of the Order of the Bath, and Sydney was awarded the battle honor, Emden, 1914. Now, the landing party, still led by Helmuth von Mucke, about 50 men, a couple of officers, petty officers, deck crew and specialists, torpedo men for the demolition work, radio men for the code books, signal men for communication. They were armed with rifles and 4 machine guns, and the operation went smoothly, since the station staff had only a few revolvers and sensibly chose not to resist. The Germans even granted the staff's one request, to drop the 50-meter radio mast clear of the tennis court. Sport must go on, after all. But as we know, the staff had already got off that fateful SOS. The experienced von Mucke saw at once how it would end and decided he'd better see to a means of escape. If, by some miracle, Emden won, the party could seize another ship and catch up. If the Australians won, far more likely, they were not going to be taken prisoner. So he surveyed a 97-ton schooner, the Aisha, lying in the lagoon. Her owner insisted she couldn't sail, but the Germans judged she needed only light repairs. They requisitioned her, raised a homemade German ensign, and, with the locals' help, took on provisions, materials, and water, then cast off, endlessly mending rigging and bilge pumps as they went. They steered northeast for neutral Dutch territory, Sumatra. Aisha reached it on the 22nd of November 1914, and on the 27th, escorted by a Dutch warship, entered the port of Padang. The Dutch meant to detain the schooner, but von Mucke and the German consul argued that doing so would violate the Hague Convention of 1907. There, von Mucke learned that Emden had been lost and that Allied cruisers were hunting him. Granted a day in port under maritime law, he secretly arranged a rendezvous with a German steamer and put back to sea on the 28th of November. In mid-December, the schooner finally met that steamer. The Germans scuttled the Aisha and transferred aboard. So ended the first leg of this 1,001 nights odyssey, in punishing conditions, short of food, nearly out of fresh water until a downpour saved them. They had sailed some 1,800 nautical miles and escaped capture.
Now aboard the steamer, von Mucke chose the boldest option: head for home. He aimed for the Arabian coast, where he'd heard a railway ran toward Mecca. In January of 1915, the party reached Hodeidah, slipping past a British patrol, only to learn the railway story was a newspaper rumor, and the nearest station was some 1,600 kilometers off. What followed was an epic. Overland toward Sana'a, turned back by hostile Bedouin. Up the Red Sea by dhow, the classic Arab lateen-rigged boat, a design borrowed from antiquity and still sailing those waters. One dhow lost on a reef, a caravan ambushed by a large Bedouin band and forced to fight, surrounded. Escapes, negotiations, more dhows, more marches. At last, in May of 1915, they reached the railway and were met by Admiral Swan, commander of the German Mediterranean Squadron, who laid on a special train. From there, it was a comfortable, even triumphant journey to Berlin by way of Constantinople. In all of it, by sea, then land, then sea, then land again, over some 11,000 kilometers, von Mucke contrived to lose only a handful of men. In Berlin, he handed over Emden's naval ensign and reported that the surviving members of the crew had come home. Von Mucke's later service took him through torpedo boat and river commands, the Euphrates in 1916, the Danube in 1917, and an appointment as navigation officer of the battle cruiser Derfflinger, the famous ship that fought at Jutland in 1916. By May of 1918, he commanded a section of a torpedo boat division. Then came the upheavals of revolution. The Kaiser abdicated, and von Mucke retired with the rank of Korvettenkapitän. He was much in demand as a lecturer, and his war memoirs, Emden and Aisha, were published in Berlin. The harsh terms of Versailles drove many German veterans into politics, including its radical fringes. Von Mucke joined the German National People's Party in 1918, then moved in 1919 to the German Workers' Party, which in 1920 became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP. As a celebrated war hero, he was a valuable figurehead, and in 1926 he was elected to the Saxon Landtag as a Nazi deputy, aligned with the party's strongly socialist wing. But the alignment didn't hold. By 1929, von Mucke had grown disgusted with the cult of personality around Hitler and reconsidered his whole position on rearmament. He left the party, embraced pacifism, and lectured and wrote against it. After Hitler became chancellor in 1933, von Mucke became a far more vocal opponent of the regime. His writings were banned as subversive. In 1936, he was briefly imprisoned in a concentration camp near Kiel as a warning to stop his opposition, and he was held intermittently over the following years, with a final spell in a camp in Hamburg around 1940, where, remarkably, the local Nazi officials still regarded him as a genuine national hero and arranged his release on health grounds. He retired to Ahrensburg near Hamburg. He lost a son on the Eastern Front in 1943 and lived out the rest of the war there. After the war, Helmuth von Mucke went on campaigning for pacifism, opposing the rearmament of West Germany and her entry into NATO. In that struggle, he lived until the 30th of July, 1957, when he died of a heart attack at Ahrensburg. Those, more or less, were the men who served aboard the cruiser Emden, and that was how the cruiser herself served. They were our enemies, of course, but in the end, if you must have enemies, let them be exactly this kind.
all the more so since enemies can sometimes turn into rather good allies. Such is the story, and that's all for today.